There are flaws in the justice system that lead to thousands of people being wrongfully convicted of crimes they didn't commit every year. False confessions, false statements by witnesses, evidence used incorrectly. All of these things and more contribute to the constant issue of miscarriages of justice in our society.
We've teamed up to bring these cases to light, to make it more widely known just how frequently this is happening in communities around us and how incredibly hard it is to fix this issue within the system. The cases we will be sharing are haunting reminders that justice is indeed blind, even when faced with the truth. Hi, I'm Elyse from the podcast True Crime Cat Lawyer. Every other Thursday, my cat Winston and I tell stories of unsolved murders, serial killers, missing persons, and so much more from our neck of the woods, the Pacific Northwest. As someone whose brother was incarcerated for nearly 8 years, I have a special place in my heart for incarcerated individuals, particularly those who were convicted as juveniles and those who were wrongfully convicted.
And this is Jess from the podcast What Happens in the Woods. We've been fascinated with the Pacific Northwest and the never-ending supply of true crime cases since relocating here in 2018. We release on the first and third Fridays during our regular seasons and every Wednesday for our WTF series. When Elyse asked Bryce and I to collaborate with her on cases of wrongful convictions, there was no way we were going to pass on the opportunity to shed light on this topic.
Together, we've created a limited series that will highlight a variety of cases that you may or may not have already heard of. Our hope is to bring them to the forefront of the true crime community and to possibly help get more information out there on these cases. You're listening to a collaboration of the podcast True Crime Cat Lawyer and What Happens in the Woods on Wrongful Convictions. Let's get started.
Welcome back, friends. We want to thank you for joining us for the continuation of our first episode in the collab that we have with Elyse and Winston from True Crime Cat Lawyer in our Wrongful Conviction series. We're so excited to start this series, and we cannot wait to bring you more cases. Before we get back into the episode, a little housekeeping. Bryce and I are still enjoying a small break, but thank you to everyone who's reached out to ask for stickers, made suggestions on cases, or, just to say hi. We greatly appreciate you all. Be on the lookout for what we have coming up next. On June 1st, everyone's favorite What the Fuck Wednesdays will resume. Also in June, we will release the next episode in our Wrongful Conviction series. And then before you know it, season 5 is going to be headed your way soon enough in August. So that's just in time to lead us into the fall season and our appearance at the Pacific Northwest True Crime Fest. So stay tuned for all the announcements and the details on our social media and the website. We want to again remind everyone to please go check out our dear friend and co-host for this collab series, True Crime Cat Lawyer. Let her know that we sent you. So here we are for part 2 in our first episode on wrongful convictions, and man, has this one been a lot. We are talking about the Dixmoor 5 and the quote-unquote confessions and also convictions of the 5 young men accused in the murder of Cateresa Matthews. Last week, we gave you all the case details, but this week, I'm going to turn the hostess duties over to Elyse as we further the discussion on this case and take a deeper look at the legal proceedings. Take it away, Elyse.
Yeah, so I want to just take us back a little bit because I think there were some things that were in Jonathan Barr's complaint. So I actually looked at Jonathan Barr's civil complaint that he filed. Okay. So I looked at a lot of information that was in there and kind of took that information because we kind of talked about this before. If something's in like a trial transcript or a motion or something that relates to a court proceeding, I take it a little bit more seriously than some other things we come across because generally people don't lie in court. Obviously there are exceptions to that. But for the most part, I think if somebody's testifying in court, they're testifying to the truth. So like we kind of discussed before, really the only thing that Veal and Sharp's statements and later testimony had in common was that all 5 teens participated in the rape and murder of Cateresa on November 19th of 1991. That was really the only thing that was in common, which I think we've discussed is incredibly troubling because like what I'm about to tell you, both stories can't be true. Like it's not possible, kind of given the timeline that they're creating and they're, telling the jury about. So Veal testified that he met up with James Harden at a candy store, and then they went to the car wash with everyone except Jonathan Barr. So they said that later they picked up Jonathan along with Cateresa. But Sharp says he was playing basketball when Robert Veal, James Harden, and Robert Taylor pulled up and asked him to come shoot dice with them. So right off the bat, like, again, 2 different accounts of what's happening. And Shainne Sharp says after he gets picked up, they go and play dice in Harden and Barr's basement for about an hour before Cateresa was assaulted. But the way they made it sound was that she was assaulted at the house in the basement.
Right.
And again, that's different than other things we've read about where she's already in the field where she's later found. And there's statements that that's where the rape and the murder occurred.
Right. It's almost like their testimony contradicts even the signed statements.
Right. So there are things that are sort of pulled from the statements that, are kind of matching. But then we also have, Robert Veal saying as soon as everybody got to James Harden and Jonathan Barr's house, Jonathan allegedly hit Cateresa in the face. Mm-hmm. And again, this is like immediate, like when they get to the house, and contradicts, what they've said before about being in the field. Mm-hmm. And at least from what I could tell, there wasn't really any mention of the field at trial. And
that's interesting.
That's very confusing to me because, obviously we have the statements that say that, but then there's also kind of no explanation of how she gets there if she's not already there to begin with. You would think that you would want to have them explain, okay, well, if we, believe that you've attacked and murdered her here, how does she end up at the field?
Yeah.
Right. And how do you explain that the autopsy report, claims that she was not moved from that spot? She was not brought there dead. They felt that scene was a contained scene where she was not moved from one place to another. It all happened there and she was killed there. How do you explain that then?
Right. Especially if you're saying, well, the boys' statements are saying we killed her on November 19th, the day she went missing. But as you talked about before, the coroner is not agreeing that that's what happened. They don't think that she died on the day that she was kidnapped or disappeared, I should say.
Right.
So that's still a huge, gap in the testimony because you have no explanation of this, difference in time.
Right.
And I don't know. I didn't come across this. I don't know if you came across this. Was there any sign of decomposition to her body?
It was minimal because the autopsy report stated that she was still clearly in rigor mortis. She had not been out in the elements very long. They were talking about the condition of her clothing being still relatively clean. There was some, dirt and debris because there was a struggle during her assault. But that it was not like she had been, and this is, wintertime. There's rain, there's snow there, it's cold, and there was not a lot of those elements, those aspects of if she's out in the cold or in the weather for 20 days, like they're saying, after she was killed, we would have expected a lot more of that to show on her person, on her clothing, on her body. It was not there. It was not there. And what I read specifically was like, there was no animal bites. There was no sign of insects. There was no, these are the things that happen when a body is on the elements. Any body, an animal body, a person's body, there is decay. There are, nature will take over. It will come in and it will take over. There was no sign of that. They clearly specifically stated her socks were still white socks, very good, clean condition compared to where she was at.
Right. And I think, like you mentioned, if she's in an open field, I don't think that, at least from what I read, there was no attempt to kind of cover her body or hide her body. Mm-mm. So she's not being protected from any kind of elements, any kind of, animal predators. And if she's been there, from November to December when she's found, she's not going to have her body look like it's only been there for a day or so.
Right.
Yeah.
That just doesn't make sense.
Absolutely not.
So they also, talked about the testimony that James Harden's father presented. Like you talked about the pay stubs he offered, really focusing on the time between 11 a.m. and 6:40 p.m. Mm-hmm. to say that, there was no way that Harden and Barr could have been involved because they were at home with their family at the time the crime was being committed. So something I found really interesting at Barr and Taylor's trials, they were tried separately. They were tried at the same time, but they had separate trials. So again, they relied on Veal and Sharp's bullshit testimonies. Mm-hmm. And the prosecution in their closing arguments acknowledged that, without the testimony of Veal and Sharp, they basically had no case. They said, mm-hmm. Without those witnesses, we would never know what happened to Cateresa Matthews. So that to me is obviously like a red flag, mm-hmm. because you're acknowledging that the information's coming from these two individuals who, are biased because they've, been given deals. But two, you're relying on the information that they supposedly provided that doesn't make sense together. Mm-hmm. So do you actually know what happened to her that day? If they're telling two different stories?
Right.
Yeah.
100%.
So I talked a little bit earlier about the Central Park Five, mm-hmm. and how when the DNA results came back and they didn't match any of the five, the police and the prosecutors sort of created this sixth man theory that, we didn't know about this sixth man who was involved and he committed the rape and all of that. So they kind of tried to do something a little bit similar, but let me get into it. So sure. Because the Dixmoor Five, because none of their DNA matched, obviously the prosecutors do have to acknowledge this to some extent. I think it's a brief acknowledgement on their part because DNA is still so new that I think a lot of people, especially on the jury, didn't necessarily have a good understanding of it. And so I think the prosecution kind of latched onto that. So one of their arguments was it belonged to a consensual partner who happened to have sex with Cateresa on the day of her murder, which I could kind of buy, except that, again, I don't know that that's still going to be present on her body if she's supposedly, laying in this field for this period of time or whatever.
Right.
It doesn't really fit for me.
No. Like even the six men, none of them said that there was a six man. You know what I mean? Like,
right. That at least that's consistent. None of them. Yeah. And my thing too is a 15, 16, 17-year-old boy, are they going to be able to not leave seminal fluid? Honestly, are they going to be able to not do that? And out of all 5 of them, none of them did, but we're assuming that they all sexually assaulted her. I cannot believe that whatsoever.
They actually did try to make that argument and said that none of them ejaculated, and that was why the DNA didn't match. Which, again, I think to your point is a little bit ridiculous for teenage boys. But 2, it still doesn't explain why it's there then.
Right.
Unless you're also putting it together with the consensual partner argument.
Right.
Did they say how old Willie was at the time of the assault?
33.
Like, how do these teenage boys not know that there was a 33-year-old man there? You know what I mean? Like, if prosecutors are trying to come up with the same theory, it's just like, come on, man.
Not only that, I did read, but I didn't mention it, and I don't know if you had the same thing. At one point, the new state's attorney, because she said that she couldn't verify that these boys were innocent, and the legal system needed to sort this out. And she really thought that they were not innocent. She at one point provided a theory that somebody came across the body and engaged in necrophilia.
Yep, that was going to be my next one.
Sorry, I didn't mean to take that from you then.
It's all good. I just wanted to briefly mention it. This one is like the most ludicrous to me. I mean, I'm sure it happens. I obviously don't have data on that or anything, but it just seems like the least likely option that they've given. Mm-hmm. It just,
yeah.
And I don't know why you would say that in court with a straight face.
And I don't know. I mean, to me, from my understanding, is the most viable option is usually what happened. You are now going way out in left field with all these supposed could be scenarios. There are not that many people who engage in necrophilia. It happens, yes, but it is not, not every serial killer, not every sexual assault, has that type of sexual assault happen. Not every killer engages in that type of act.
Right.
To assume that this just randomly happened after these 5 boys sexually assaulted her and left no DNA evidence on her, the hairs were not a match, there were no fingerprints on her, but this guy just randomly came through a field and engaged in necrophilia with her, dead. I'm sorry, what? I can't. Yeah. I can't believe that. Yes, exactly. Like you said, I can't even believe that statement was made and that she made it with a straight face. That the prosecutors even might have made that statement and said that with a straight face and not, I don't know, been able to say that and not choke on your own words. You really think highly of yourself. You really got an ego, I think.
Yeah. So like we kind of talked about earlier, all of their direct appeals, so the appeals they get right after they're convicted, you get sort of an automatic appeal of that conviction. And so all of their direct appeals were unsuccessful. And most of their kind of post-conviction relief was also unsuccessful. You had kind of mentioned, the DNA testing. They tried in 2005 to get testing done. There's like a statute in Illinois that allows for specific post-conviction DNA testing. And so they, tried to get new testing under that law. And again, this was at the time where CODIS now existed. So we did have a database that we could compare it to. We didn't have to have, a specific person in mind that we were trying to match it to, which, is obviously beneficial for these 5 men because, we're trying to figure out who it is and, again, establish that it's not them. So, of course, the prosecutors have objected and tried to bar any kind of testing for, basically since they got these boys convicted. So eventually, Barr and Taylor have to go to the Illinois appellate court, and the appellate court agreed with the prosecutors, and they specifically said that, quote, additional DNA comparison analysis was not materially relevant to the defendant's claims of actual innocence, end quote. So they said that the evidence against Barr and Taylor was overwhelming, and even a CODIS match wouldn't significantly advance their claims of innocence.
What were they looking at?
That just blew my mind. Like, even if they got a DNA match, that wouldn't prove anything. Wow.
What evidence, though? What evidence? There was no physical evidence that linked these boys. None.
Exactly. And so the use of the word overwhelming was really troubling to me because, again, you're relying on the testimony and the statements of these 2 boys who were given a deal in exchange for their testimony. And, we're later going to talk about kind of their treatment in getting to these statements. It's troublesome that you're saying there's overwhelming evidence that even, DNA testing can't refute, essentially.
Right. Especially during these times. I mean, it wasn't 1990s anymore. We were into the DNA age, so to speak. There was enough data out there in regards to how significant DNA was and how relevant it was to cases and to prosecutions and to convicting the actual person responsible for a crime. We knew all that at this point when these appeals were being denied. And when that was, I can't even believe that that's their choice of wording.
Yeah. And something else that I don't think you touched on was that, yes, eventually after they got the DNA match to Willie Randolph, they, eventually got their convictions vacated, Barr, Harden, and Taylor. But that was actually like a delayed process because the prosecution actually launched a reinvestigation of the case. And so instead of, just relying on the information that they had, they, wanted to conduct this reinvestigation. And so that took another, couple months before they then, dismissed all the charges and vacated their sentences. So Barr, Harden, and Taylor all received certificates of innocence, and they all received $208,000 in state compensation. So that, I believe, I'm not quite sure because it didn't explicitly mention, but I believe that was from the actual county, not the officers, which we'll get into. So this was in addition to the 40 million that you had talked about earlier.
Right. Okay.
Because they're terrible people, the Cook County Prosecutor's Office didn't issue an apology to the Dixmoor Five until 2016. So again, this is 5 years after their sentences are vacated and they've found, Willie Randolph and have arrested him. So before I kind of get to the legalities of the federal wrongful lawsuit that I reviewed for Jonathan Barr, I did want to cover just a couple of things, just so that people are kind of clear on what we're talking about and like what an exoneration actually means, because it does have, a very specific meaning in the legal field. So generally, an exoneration occurs when a person who was convicted of a crime is officially cleared of that crime based on new evidence that establishes that person's innocence. So I think I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into that definition, just because I think it's helpful to know why an exoneration is incredibly important for a person who's been wrongfully convicted. It's different than, a person being released early. And it has a very, like I said before, it has a very special meaning in the law. So I used the National Registry of Exonerations website heavily for this episode. It's maintained by the University of California, the University of Michigan Law School, and the Michigan State University College of Law. And it's an incredible resource that if you're interested in wrongful conviction cases, their website has this comprehensive database of wrongful convictions in the United States, and it breaks down various evidence that can lead to wrongful convictions, like police interrogations, prosecutorial misconduct, witness identification, DNA. And it also has synopses of every wrongful conviction that's included in the database. And it has, different table breakdowns. It's, like I said, it's an amazing resource if you're interested in this topic. So I would encourage you to definitely check that website out if you are interested in wrongful convictions. So according to their website, a person has been exonerated if he or she was convicted of a crime and following a post-conviction re-examination of the evidence in the case was either declared to be factually innocent by a government official or agency, or they were relieved of all of the consequences of the criminal conviction by a government official with the authority to take that action. So again, when it comes to an exoneration, that official action can either be a complete pardon, an acquittal of all charges factually related to the crime, or a dismissal of all charges. So for the third option, a dismissal is either granted by a court or a prosecutor who has the authority to enter a dismissal. So one of the big things that's important to remember is that a pardon, an acquittal, or a dismissal has to be based, at least in part, by evidence of innocence that wasn't presented at the original trial, or if the person entered into a plea, that evidence of innocence wasn't known to the parties at the time the plea deal was entered into. So the focus is really on that evidence of innocence. It's not enough if there's just, unexplained physical evidence of a person's guilt. That's not enough to say that a person's been exonerated. You really have to show evidence of innocence.
Okay. That's pretty heavy to have to come, like, that's a lot. I can imagine.
It is. It's a high burden. And I think it's almost like a catch-22. It's like you do want it to be a high burden to some extent because you don't want just anybody to sort of bring this allegation forth, that they were wrongfully convicted and all that. But at the same time, for people like the Dixmoor Five, who were clearly in, a very bad position to, defend themselves, protect themselves, all of that. Mm-hmm. It's frustrating that they have such a high burden because they so clearly have, evidence that they were not treated properly from the very beginning.
Right. Yeah. And to have to go above and beyond that even more. I just can't imagine, how that weighs on them. You're sitting in jail, you didn't do anything, and nobody in the justice system, aside from these lawyers that actually come in and start taking on their cases, pro bono to help them with these appeals and the DNA and everything, nobody's listening to you. Nobody's giving your voice any, credence, basically. And mentally, you would have to be a very strong person to be able to survive just on a daily basis, just to survive in your environment. And then to have to keep fighting and to keep reiterating what should be clear and evident to anybody that looks at this information. I definitely, I commend these men, because whether they have, done right or wrong since they left prison, or what has happened to them, or, whatever, they got through that, and I cannot imagine how hard that was for them. Yeah. When, nobody's listening to you.
Yeah. It's one of those things where I think a lot of people are quick to sort of write it off like, oh, they all say they're innocent. Mm-hmm. Everybody that's in prison says they're innocent. But like you said, if you actually sort of peel back the layers, there's, evidence that they are innocent, and that there was something wrong with the process and the way they were treated that got them to where they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we discussed this a little bit before we started recording, but one of the interesting things I found on the National Registry's website was this kind of table of top counties in the United States as far as their exonerations go. So Cook County, where the Dixmoor 5 case took place, has more false confessions than the rest of the nation combined. Mm-hmm. In fact, they have almost 6 times more exonerations than the national average.
I am so glad that you mentioned that, because I kind of thought you would, because I'm sure that, like, if I had seen that information, I'm sure that I was like, yeah, I'm sure she's going to see that information. But when I read those statistics, and then to further see that, some of the like the police, the higher ups in the police department in Dixmoor later got into a lot of trouble on other, not necessarily related to the Dixmoor 5, but in other cases. Some of those people really got into a lot of trouble on how they were handling, arrests, getting statements from people, and how they processed evidence and things like that. And that alone should give these gentlemen an opportunity to have their cases reexamined, you would think. And even that did not do so. So to have those statistics, to know that information, it should make everything that those people have done in any case that they've touched be unviable. You would think. I would think. And it did not.
Yeah. So one of the things that comes up a little bit later, you had mentioned the, $40 million settlement. I believe it's still the highest in that county and in Illinois state, but one that was really close was in 1999, they paid out $36 million to the Ford Heights Four, who were wrongfully convicted in a 1978 murder case. Mm-hmm. So for me, there's a lot of problem if you're paying out these high settlements and you have, an exoneration rate of, 6 times the national average. There's clearly something going on here that is not, it doesn't pass the smell test, as they say, because why are you paying out these huge settlements, and why do you have like the highest exoneration rate in the United States if everything's sort of going as it should?
Right. Yeah. Red flags all over.
Yeah. So I read a law review article as well from Northwestern University School of Law, and it specifically looked at juvenile confessions and exculpatory DNA in Cook County, Illinois. So it was written in 2010. So this was before, the men were exonerated and Willie Randolph was, convicted and arrested and all that. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the term exculpatory, it simply means evidence that's favorable to a defendant that could either exonerate the person or at least cast some doubt as to the culpability or guiltiness of the person. So, like I said, this article really stood out to me. One, it has a lot of information about the Dixmoor Five, but two, it's specifically looking at coerced confessions and exculpatory DNA evidence, which are obviously, two of the really big factors in the Dixmoor Fives case. Mm-hmm. So, according to the article, from 1991 to 2001, this kind of 10-year period, there were at least 247 murder cases where the police had obtained incriminating statements from so-called defendants that were later thrown out by the courts because they were tainted in some way.
Wow. So
the article also mentions that Cook County prosecutors continued to try and keep, the Dixmoor Five's original convictions intact, even though there was clear DNA evidence that cut against the men being guilty. I read a different report from the National Registry on Exonerations that kind of talked about, they have, like I said before, they have different resources on prosecutorial issues that lead to exonerations, police issues that lead to exonerations, eyewitness testimony, all of that. So they kind of break things down and provide resources for each of those topics. So one of the articles I read, this is not specific to Cook County, Illinois, but just sort of across the nation as a whole. Prosecutors commit misconduct in 30% of wrongful convictions.
Oh, wow.
And again, according to their report on the topic, very few prosecutors, I believe it said something like 17%, are ever disciplined for their misconduct.
Oh.
Which is very troubling.
Yes, very much. And
the most disturbing statistic I found in that report is that prosecutorial misconduct occurred in 72% of murder cases where defendants were later exonerated.
Wow. 72% is very high.
That's way too high.
Very high. It's like I said, it's very troubling because murder is obviously the most serious crime to commit, to be, charged and convicted with. It's, the ultimate crime, essentially.
Yeah.
And so if you're not putting your case together well enough to where 75% of these cases are, not being conducted properly and we're convicting innocent people, essentially, there's a huge problem there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because as you say, Elyse, a high number, but then the number, what did you say, 17% that were only getting or being held accountable for it? So if your conviction rate, even though it was wrong at 75%, but only 17% are getting punished, they're just like, okay, we'll do whatever we want. There's no repercussions for being wrong in your, wow.
There's no repercussions for having to do your job.
Yeah.
That honestly.
We might just call you a weatherman.
Right. I mean, if you're wrong that much. Yeah. Shoot.
Yeah, and I think it's even more alarming because, like you said, the 17% is a very small percentage, but that's also just what they said was the national average. I mean, I bet if you looked in Cook County specifically, it's probably even smaller than 17% because of all these, things that were going on. So it's even more troubling that, you have this super high percentage of misconduct in a murder case where somebody is literally on trial for their life.
Right.
And nobody's being held accountable for the fact that they put an innocent person in jail. And sometimes, I obviously didn't do the research for this, but I know that there's been plenty of people that have been put to death that did not commit the crime.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, no. And that's, I mean, that I don't know what's sadder is that their life ended in jail or, that these children go into the prison system and they have no life for X amount of years. Yeah. And then they have to come out and reassimilate in some way. And are they getting, help with their mental health to be able to do that? Have they lost family members along the way? Their support system, what is it? Are they going to be able to find a job? I just don't know what's sadder, that you lost a life, altogether, or that you lost the life that you thought you had. Both is a loss. It's either way you look at it, you've lost your life, whether it was physically or mentally. You've lost your future. Yeah. You have no future. And I don't know. Yeah. I mean, either one is wrong and it's sad. It doesn't matter. I just don't know what's worse. I think they're both equally bad.
So that brings us to Jonathan Barr's federal civil complaint. Like I said, I think that they all filed complaints that were similar, but Jonathan Barr's was the only one I was able to find online. So basically, he in this lawsuit is seeking accountability and compensation for the official misconduct and abuse of power that robbed him of the most formative and vibrant years of his life when he would have been graduating from high school, pursuing a career, and starting a family. And like you had mentioned earlier, James Harden and Jonathan Barr actually lost both of their parents and I believe a grandmother while they were incarcerated, and they were not able to attend any of those funerals. They couldn't pay any last respects, anything like that. And that's something that you can never get back.
No.
There's no amount of compensation, amount of, having your sentence vacated, your certificate of innocence. It's good to have all that, and it's important to have all that, but it's not going to give you back the time that you missed with those people.
Right.
And, it doesn't change. I mean, I'm sure that their parents knew that they were innocent, but it doesn't change the fact that they never got to see that come to fruition and have that, moment with their sons.
Right.
And so that's, why this wrongful conviction lawsuit was initiated. I think we see this in most wrongful conviction cases, as we should, because if you're innocent and you're so clearly innocent, like in this case, you absolutely should have a recourse against the people that put you in prison. So you had mentioned earlier when you were going through the background, this anonymous 911 call.
Right.
That took place. So in the complaint, this call was actually made by Willie Randolph.
No.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yes. So like you talked about, he lived about a mile and a half away from where Cateresa's grandmother lived. And so near both of their houses was this restaurant called Frank's Pizza.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a location where Willie had already sexually assaulted, raped a girl.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where he would later make a 911 call on November 27th, just, a week or so, a little over a week after Cateresa disappeared. He made a call to 911 and said he saw a body in that field. And so I think initially it was, an anonymous call, but once they got the tape recording of it, police knew that it was Willie Randolph, and they got this recording on December 20th. And so in Barr's complaint, he alleges that detectives either failed to further investigate that call, or they suppressed any evidence that they uncovered linking the call to Randolph.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Because that information was not provided at the time of their trials.
So December 20th, meaning when her body was found, like after her body was found.
Right.
Wow.
And at that point, no statement had been made by anybody that these 5 boys were involved.
Right.
So they really did not follow up whatsoever.
Correct. And so in Barr's complaint, he talked about a sort of turning point in their investigation when they really started focusing on the Dixmoor 5. And in the words of his complaint, it's essentially saying, they overlooked or just blatantly ignored the incriminating evidence against Randolph. So before I get to that turning point, Randolph makes the 911 call. Police are aware of that. He's a known sex offender, violent sex offender.
Mm-hmm.
Police know that. Police know who he is. He's this kind of quote unquote career criminal.
Mm-hmm.
He was arrested for possession of crack cocaine on March 8th, 1992.
Mm-hmm.
A few months later, he was arrested again and convicted of unlawful use of a weapon. And then he actually served 4 years in prison for that. But right before Cateresa's disappearance and murder, he was out on parole.
Mm-hmm.
So, he wasn't in prison anymore. He was just out and about. So police had all of this information. They had all of this knowledge about him. But they learned that James Harden, Barr's brother, had dated Cateresa the summer before her murder. And that's when investigators really started to focus on the Dixmoor 5. And I'm not sure, it wasn't quite clear in that complaint how Keno Barnes fits in, but it kind of sounded like they might have just rounded up some of their friends.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, everything just kind of snowballed after Keno Barnes made his little statement, allegedly.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of talked about earlier, officers really preying on Robert Veal.
Mm-hmm.
We see this in the Central Park 5 case as well. They really singled out Corey in that case because he, was mentally disabled and didn't have the same mental capacity that the others did. And so he was easier to manipulate. Well, that was kind of, Robert Veal in this case. He had the learning disability, the mental disability. He had difficulty reading and writing. He had the IQ of 56. But I also read that he suffered from an anxiety disorder, and he was actually deaf in his right ear. So just all of these things made him incredibly vulnerable to manipulation by the police. He's this poor child that, they're not protecting by giving him access to his grandma, to his mom, to a lawyer, anything like that. And his interrogation wasn't recorded.
No, none of them were, right? None of them were.
Right.
Yeah. Which
makes sense because according to Robert, he was yelled at, he was threatened. They used other coercive tactics on him to get him to confess. And I'm not entirely clear from everything I read, because the officers did handwrite statements for some of the other boys. But it seemed like in Robert Veal's case, they definitely had to do that because he had difficulties with reading and writing. So I don't know that he would have been able to write anything out if they had asked him to.
No. And from what I understood, because I watched an interview with the then state's attorney that witnessed these signatures, and he didn't want to talk about it for a long time. He didn't want to give interviews about it because essentially he knew he had been in the wrong a lot. And it wasn't with just the Dixmoor 5. There was a lot of other cases. But he eventually came around and did an interview. And in that interview, he said basically he was ashamed of what they had done. I mean, without coming out and saying, he admitted his wrong in the situation, but he did say that, in this case, those statements were not anything that the boys could have given them because the boys had no knowledge of this at all. The police had been sitting on this information for a year and fed all of that information through the statements. There is no way that Robert Veal would have been able to give them that information. No way at all. There was no way. He had no part in any of that was written on that statement. And it was not his handwriting, and it was not his information that came from him.
Right. And even more, maybe not even more troubling, but also troubling is the fact that he couldn't even verify what was in the statement as being accurate.
Right.
Because like I said, he had difficulty reading. And so he probably had no idea what that paper said. No. They could have said this statement says, you've provided us all the information you could, and we're going to send you home now.
Right.
And he has no reason to believe any differently and can't, mentally provide anything differently because he doesn't have the capability to, verify what's in that statement.
Right. To disregard it or verify it in any way.
Right. So during Barr's own interrogation, you had mentioned, and I found this to be true as well, that he always maintained his innocence. He never signed any statement. He refused, I will give him kudos and credit because to stay true to himself and to say, no, I was not involved in this and I'm not signing anything. I was not involved in this. I'm innocent. Even when, they're handcuffing him to a wall, they hit him on the back of the head. They're screaming and yelling at him. They even lied to him and told him that his brother James confessed to the crime and implicated him.
Right.
But he maintained his innocence. He refused to sign anything, which I think is incredibly brave. even though he should absolutely have that right to do that, I think given everything that we saw in this case, I absolutely would have understood if he had signed something.
Yeah. Because he was 15 years old.
Yeah, he was 15. He was being lied to by police. He was being, harassed and coerced. And I understand the, mental torture, like we talked about, that brings out in a person. And at some point, you just want it all to stop.
Right.
And the police are sitting there telling you, oh, if you just sign this, if you just do this, we'll let you go home.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're a teenager and you don't have any advocate present for you because the police have decided that they're not going to follow that, I'm very surprised, but also very proud that he was able to be that advocate for himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As best as he could at 15.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. It's definitely, it's heartbreaking that he should even have to. And we've talked about the mental weight that would add to a child. They're children. That's the thing. I don't care when you turn 18. If the law considers you an adult, you're a child. You don't know anything about life. Yeah. And you may have had some hard experiences. You may have gotten to that point and it wasn't easy and it was rough, but you are still a child. You are still navigating your way through this world. And just because you magically go from 17 to 18, that doesn't mean anything that you suddenly become this wiser person. To be at that age at 15 years old and have to take that upon yourself and know that you have to be strong for yourself and you have to mentally survive this along with the physical survival mode that you're in. It is a testament to him. I mean, it's a testament to all of them that they did what they had to do to survive. It is. But in his case, really, it is. I don't know that I could have done that at 15. I really don't.
Right. And I think, like Bryce was talking about before, this is still, I think, an era where I think when the crime actually happened, it was before Rodney King.
Right.
Yeah. And so it was still in an era where kids were being taught to, obey and respect the police. And, just there was a very different view of police than there is, for example, today. Mm-hmm. And I think Rodney King changed a lot of that when that all happened. Mm-hmm. But there's still, if you're raised in that setting where, you need to help the police however you can. And, if you need to talk to them and answer their questions, like you need to do that. And it was a very different time that I think they probably just thought they were helping. She was a classmate of theirs,
right?
A friend of theirs. And I think, they probably did want to help solve their friend's, murder.
Right.
Not realizing that in doing so, they were the ones who were going to be implicated in that.
Right.
So one of the things I had mentioned, we've talked about it quite a bit, but, just given all of the issues with Cook County interrogations, their prosecutions, just their ridiculously high exoneration rate, the $40 million settlement was reached with the Illinois State and the Dixmoor Police. So, like I mentioned earlier, this is different than the money that the three men had received from the state. This was actually against the Illinois State Police and the Dixmoor Police. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was really interesting that the settlement that they reached with the Dixmoor Five was the same as the ones the Central Park Five received about a week prior to the Dixmoor Five settlement.
Oh,
interesting.
So in my mind, I hope, I didn't find any information of this, but I hope that the attorneys for the Dixmoor Five kind of saw that and use that as leverage to get the same kind of compensation for their clients. Because like we've talked about, there's so many similarities between the two cases.
Right.
That I think it absolutely was justified to argue for the same compensation.
Oh, yeah.
Almost the identical events happened in both cases. And this case just, it's frustrating on so many levels. But I remember watching When They See Us on Netflix. And it was hard to watch the whole time. But the particular episode in the little mini series where they go through Corey's interrogation I had such a hard time watching that episode, and it reminds me so much of what I imagined Robert Veal going through. Again, you don't want any of these kids to go through anything like this, but somebody who does not have the same capacity as, someone their age normally has, they're already at a disadvantage when they're talking to police.
Right.
And I think you're not allowing anyone there to protect them. They don't know how to protect themselves. They think that they're just helping you. And if they help you, they're going to get to go home.
Right.
And it's just, I would be curious to know. It's hard to want to be curious about this, but I would be curious to know how many wrongful conviction cases stem from a situation where somebody is at a, mental capacity that's not, they have a mental disability, because I think that that's so much easier to manipulate the person by the police.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that holds a special place in our hearts because of our daughter having an intellectual disability. I have not finished that miniseries for that reason, because it is too easy for me to put her in that position and to see that and to feel it on a very personal level. And I have a very hard time. This case, once I read that about Robert Veal, I had a very hard time continuing without being very overly emotionally distraught. And not just because of him, but because what the other men, went through and endured too. I had a very hard time reading about the Central Park Five. I have not finished that series because of that, because it is a visual, to me, it's a visual thing, and I can easily put my daughter in that. I can see it, and I cannot, I cannot disassociate then to get facts, to go forward with, you have to remove yourself from a situation to be able to sometimes handle those types of details. And in these cases where it involves people with any sort of disability or, anything like that, I can't. I just can't. I am automatically emotionally invested, and it's very distressing. So like you said, there's no amount of money that compensates for that. And there's the fact that he was probably put in general population prison, at the young age of what, 16, 17, with a mental, with an intellectual disorder of any sort, with the low IQ of that. It makes me furious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like he was victimized to begin with when he was interrogated. He was victimized when he was, wrongfully convicted. And then he was victimized again, when he was in prison. I obviously don't have information about this, but I can only imagine how men in prison would treat someone with a mental disability, not necessarily in a negative way. I mean, yes, negative, but more in the sense that, kind of manipulating him and being able to get him to do certain things and being able to, again, kind of make him feel like, oh, these things are fine. Like these things are normal. These things always happen, that kind of thing. I think just like we talked about, there's no amount of money that can make up for what happened to them while they were in prison.
No, never.
When they shouldn't have been.
Right.
And even if you had a cushy, quote unquote, time, it was still time away from your family. Life. It was time, away from being able to work, go to school, do all of that. And I know I read for, I think almost all of them, while they were in this sort of transition period between being exonerated and going through the lawsuit and kind of resolving that, they all, even though they had these certificates of innocence, their convictions had been vacated, they still had trouble finding jobs.
Yeah.
Right. They still were labeled. The label doesn't go away.
Right. And it's, like we talked about, it's like the Central Park Five. They were still labeled as that, regardless of, the settlement, the exonerations. And I think that that's part of why they made that series, was sort of taking that name back for themselves.
Right.
And changing what it meant to them. I didn't find any information on this, but I would be curious to know if, like in the Central Park Five case, what impact all of this had on all of their relationships, like with each other.
Yeah.
Did this sort of burn bridges and friendships and the relationship between Barr and Harden? I do know that they remained close.
It seemed like they did. Yeah.
They remained close and looked out for each other when they were in prison.
Yeah. And it seemed like Shainne Sharp, I don't want to say he had it the worst, but he definitely had more experiences with the law after his incarceration for, and even though he was out in about 8 years, released for his part in testifying, his interaction with the law did not end. And it seemed like when I watched interviews with him, it seemed like he really, and rightfully so. I mean, I can't even say any different, but he was so disgruntled. So, the anger at the situation was just there, and it wasn't going away, and it wasn't gonna go away. And there was just there, he lost his grandma while he was in prison, and he was angry at the world. And I don't know if he still is or not. I don't want to speak for him. Obviously that's his voice to share, but that was my reading from it. And I just couldn't blame him. I couldn't blame him at all. Yeah. I would be so angry at everybody every day.
Yeah. I mean, to piggyback on what you said, Elyse, was like, I always think there's two courts. There's the legal court and then the court of public opinion. And I think, with the legal, he was cleared, exonerated, or, they were
eventually he was.
But like you said, when they got out and they have to find jobs and they have to find, reassimilate into life, it's that court of public opinion that's already set.
Right.
I mean, and I think it's sad, but I think more people need to realize that, hey, some people get it wrong and they were wrongly convicted.
Right.
And and we should treat them as such, and just, I know memory is hard to let go of and hard to forget, and it also goes along with that, following up where we had talked about, corrections on life or stories or updates. So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just thinking, that it's important to remember that the false confessions weren't just made while they were, being interrogated. There's actual, tactics that police use. And like I mentioned, they were yelling at these guys. They were threatening them. They were lying to them. They, hit some of them. There's things that caused these boys to falsely confess, the ones that did. I think it's important to understand that this whole belief that no one would ever confess to a crime they didn't commit is not true.
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Grown men confess to things that they've never done. Yeah. Grown women, who know better, and there is no reason for them to admit to these things. There's none. They, other than they might be coerced into it, or they may have a limited mental capacity, or, it happens all the time. It happens all the time. And it just, I feel like you should never be able to convict somebody just based on a confession. That a jury of their peers, whatever that meant back in, the 90s, because, you didn't have teenagers on those juries. You didn't, right. I'm sure a lot of them were not African-American women or men on that jury. To be convicted based off of misinformation, inconsistent statements, and that's it. That's all you got is a really fancy talking, prosecutor up there with a lot of facts and information. And aren't we so lucky that we have these confessions? Otherwise, we'd never know what happened to Cateresa Matthews. Did the jury really deliberate? Did they really think long and hard about what made sense and what didn't make sense?
No, that was one of my questions for Elyse was, did we know the makeup of the jury?
I did not see that. I don't know.
I didn't see it anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah. I just don't feel that it was what it should have been.
Yeah.
Right. And I think too, when you're looking at, two of them being tried as adults, they really weren't a jury of their peers, because I think in juvenile cases, it's usually decided by a judge. And I think that allows more fairness in some sense, because you can't really have a jury of your peers when you're a teenager. We don't allow jurors, to be, I think it's 18 and older. Yeah. So you're never going to have an accurate representation of your peers.
Right.
So it was really a disservice to be tried as an adult, because then you're sort of forcing this jury that's probably not like these boys, don't look like them, all that. You're forcing them to see these boys as adults, even though they're not.
Right. And, yeah. And like I said, just because you turn 18 doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're an adult and you're grown and that all the things that you're supposed to know as an adult. There is still so much that can affect and that needs to happen for a person to grow that doesn't happen right away when you're 18. It may in some people, it may not for another 10 years for some people. Some people are lucky enough to lead a sheltered enough life where they are allowed to age appropriately and to learn appropriate to those steps in life that you should. Not everybody's fortunate like that. But the chances of you getting a jury that will share the similarities of life at the time where you're in that position in life, it's a joke almost. It is really a joke that you can ever presume to have a jury of someone's peers. You know?
Right. And I think too, obviously compassion doesn't come into play with a jury, right. But I think if your sort of starting point is you're innocent until you're proven guilty, and it's the prosecution's job to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, you really have to understand what beyond a reasonable doubt means, and recognizing that you're innocent until proven guilty. And so the focus should always be on the prosecution and their case. And why are you believing these conflicting testimonies?
Yeah.
It's just not possible for both of them to be true.
No.
Because they're essentially, working off of the same timeline. So either one happened or the other happened. They couldn't have both happened if they're supposed to take place in the same, timeline.
Yeah, there's no physical way, especially as varied as it was. We met up here, we went to here, we ended up here. None of that was consistent.
Right. And like I said, at trial, I didn't even recall reading anything where they mentioned going to the field.
Right.
Which seemed,
I'm not sure.
I mean, I guess you can sort of, explain away that they didn't kill her there. They brought her there, but they never said that.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're making the jury kind of try to connect these dots that aren't there.
Right.
Which to me is like, aren't you sort of saying there's reasonable doubt then? Because you've left out all of these pieces. Like, you're not painting a complete picture for them of what happened.
Right.
So how are they supposed to know what happened?
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know how any of them got convicted. I don't know how any of this went to trial. I don't understand it from the get-go. I don't understand it.
The only thing I can say is the time that it took place. I've talked ad nauseum about the Central Park 5, but I think it was similar in that, they talk about in that miniseries, the quote unquote wild-in that teens were doing at that time. And I think just really leaning heavily into that is a problem, because you don't have any physical evidence that they were anywhere near this girl that day. You have the word of some people that were coerced, that, their statements don't coincide, like they contradict each other. To me, if I were a prosecutor and this was the evidence I had, there's no way I would take any of that to trial.
Right.
Because it's a mess. And I don't want to have to try to reconcile the mess.
Right. I mean, that's the thing, is it was on them to prove it. And they really, it blows my mind that they really just didn't even have to. They didn't even have to try. They really just, I don't know, everything aligned just right so that this went through, no matter how many red flags were raised. And I don't know. Yeah. It's an incredible thing that it happened. And it's incredible to think that for this one isolated, set of events, how many times it's happened. Not only now that, things are coming to light in the Chicago area and the Illinois state, it's happened everywhere. It's happened everywhere. There's no state that doesn't have similar stories to this during this time period, and even more recent.
Right.
Yeah. It's just so evident to, I guess, looking back on it now, and for those who really were looking at the time, how many wrong pieces were tried to put together in this puzzle that didn't fit at all.
Yeah, it's like you have that piece that's, I mean, you can kind of get it in there. It doesn't quite fit, but it sort of does. And you're like, that's good enough.
It's good enough. Exactly. Yeah, good enough took away these people's lives for years.
That's not the standard.
Yeah.
And I think, too, one of the things I came across a lot was what a disservice this was to Cateresa.
Right.
Too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because these boys didn't commit this crime. And so for the entire time that they were in prison, her murder was still unsolved.
Right. And her family thought they had answers and then had to relive it all again.
Yeah.
Right.
When they found the accurate person, when they found the actual person who committed the crime, they had to relive that crime all over again for her. And grieve that for her all over again. And I mean, I watched a true crime show where the father was interviewed, and he said, if you had known the things that I knew about, that I was told about how this happened and what happened to my daughter, you would have wanted those boys dead too. And that to me was that's a very strong statement, because it wasn't that he knew the truth. It was what was told to him. Mm-hmm. And because of that, he wanted them taken. He wanted their lives taken. He wanted them put to death.
Yep.
That's a very heavy thing to reconcile, I think, as a parent, that your child's life was taken and you in turn expect the same is going to happen to whoever did that to her. And then for it to be years later that you find out that it wasn't even those people. And, all of that time spent where you hated them, you wanted them dead, you couldn't, you wanted justice for your child. And then to find out that you didn't even get that.
Yeah. And I will say one of the things I found, just a little silver lining, is that I think it was her mom was interviewed, and she, fully believes that they had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. And, I don't think I mentioned it, but police and prosecutors have come out since 2016 and said that, Willie Randolph had no connection to the Dixmoor Five, and there's no ties between them. And so Cateresa's mom, just, having her hear and accept that these boys weren't involved, and just being able to move on from that and, kind of heal that for herself, but also not having this like vindictive sort of, feelings about it. She's able to sort of process everything that happened and, still have justice for her daughter, but also be able to feel compassion for those boys.
Yeah.
Even though, like you said, like, I'm sure that she had those same feelings as Cateresa's dad in the beginning, when she was being fed all of these things. It's got to be hard, like you said, to reconcile that and sort of walk those feelings back that you felt for so long. Right.
Yeah. And I think the father was able to eventually come to that conclusion too. And in the documentary that I watched, he actually met Shainne Sharp and Jonathan Barr and James Harden in person. And they were able to, connect and make a connection and like you said, it's a small silver lining to the story that these people actually now can grieve the right way and move on with their lives the right way. And there's no longer that guilt of, I was wrongfully hateful of this person who didn't even commit the crime,
Right.
Yeah. And it's important.
It is. But I understand how that would be hard, just to kind of take a step back and again, just what the circumstances were back in, 1992 to where they are now, just being able to acknowledge that, these miscarriages of justice do happen. And I think I'm glad that they were, finally charging Randolph with everything. I'm not really sure why it took 5 years, but
right.
That's neither here nor there.
Yeah, I couldn't find any good reason for that.
Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Obviously mistakes were made, and they continued to be made by many different parties.
Right. And I understand, wanting to dot your I's, cross your T's, especially after, you looked really stupid for a long time. But you're also just, like we said, I think there's a little bit of Cateresa being lost in everything. It's super important to talk about what happened to the Dixmoor Five for sure, because there was also a miscarriage of justice that happened to them.
Right.
But, they had the opportunity to give justice to Cateresa way back when that would have been correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Not just, I need to close this case. All of this evidence that I've fabricated is going to do that for me. Why isn't the truth more important?
Exactly. You are exactly right. If you were comfortable bringing charges against these 5 boys, knowing that there's no way that they were responsible for any of it, and you were pushing it and fabricating it and coercing them into going along with it. Yet when the truth finally comes out and there is scientific proof, there is scientific evidential proof that links one man to the crime, you then, for some reason, just can't do it. You can't reconcile yourself to the fact that is the truth and make sure that is prosecuted, that's put forth and that there's an end there for the victim. It doesn't make sense to me how you're quick to jump in there and say, oh yeah, it was these boys, it was them. And we've got all these statements, and then actual proof comes forward and you just, well, we're not sure. Let's take a step back. Let's really look at this and evaluate and make sure we're doing everything the right way. Sure, take your time and do it the right way. Not 5 years.
Yeah.
Absolutely no reason for it to take that long. When you have DNA evidence, you caught him in a lie when you talked to him. He said that he didn't know who this person was and there was no way that he was around them. You were, because your semen was there. And, there's no way. There's no way that it takes 5 years when you actually have proof of evidence to bring charges to somebody.
Right.
It blows my mind. Yeah. I don't know.
That's all I have about this terrible case. The information about Cook County was illuminating.
Yes.
To me.
Yes.
And I feel like, in our next series, we'll probably come across more to cover from there.
Oh yeah. I am very sure that, this is unfortunately, it's not isolated. It's not isolated, and it's not fixed.
Right.
You know, that is the problem with the system. Is the system is, it is not infallible because it is, as humans, we are not infallible. We get things wrong. We make mistakes. We base things on judgment when they're, you know, we shouldn't, and there's evidence. We have bias. And whether it's explicitly, you know, said in this particular case for the Dixmoor 5, whether it was racially, you know, motivated, where there was like, well, here's this African American girl who was murdered and you know, assaulted. Let's just round up some other people in the community and we'll get it taken care of, and it'll be a nice, neat little bow, and we'll send them on their way. And isn't that what everybody wants to know? Is that we you know, solve this problem? Were any of those police officers, you know, other than white? I don't know. The state's attorney, he was, I could not tell that he was anything other than white. So, you know, that leads me to believe that the jury was not of their peers. They were probably mostly white. Was this racially, you know, motivated? Was anybody concerned about there being any truth because of the color of their skin? And I think that is a consistent problem that a lot of these cases are going to have too. And it's incredibly frustrating. Even in the 90s, it's incredibly frustrating.
Right.
Yeah. So like you said, this is a horrible case, but it is not an isolated case.
No, not at all. But I'm definitely looking forward to continuing our series and just, you know, trying to help educate people about why wrongful convictions happen and how important it is to reform, you know, police tactics, prosecutorial tactics, just making our justice system better. You know, I think a lot of people have a problem with the criminal justice system protecting defendants and their rights. But that's one, it's literally the founder's intent and idea of the process. But two, if you or someone you love and know in your life are ever in that situation, I would expect that you would want the most protection of your rights that you could possibly have.
Right.
I know I would, you know, and so I want a system that has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I'm guilty. Because if I didn't do something, I don't want you to throw me in jail because, you know, police were able to secure some BS statement from somebody that says I did something.
Yeah.
You know, it just, yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing this series with you guys.
Very much. I have really enjoyed like our conversation about this. And as much as you can enjoy this conversation, let's put it that way. I think that I think there's a lot more of open conversation that we can have on these types of cases. And like you said, education is key. And I am open enough to know that I don't know nearly everything that I would hope to know for these cases, but I want to learn because education in how this works and what it means for you as a citizen every day in your life, what rights you have, what rights can be easily taken away from you, and how that goes down and what that means. It is so important and so relevant today. And you know, I think that's something that's been missing, the education aspect of how the court system works, how the criminal system works. We were just expected to go along with it. You know, those are the bad people. If you're a good person, then you have nothing to worry about. Cooperate and you'll be able to go on your way. That's not the reality. So yeah, the education, you know, things that I want to learn about and how things work. I'm excited for that.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys again for collaborating with us. We are super excited to, like I said, continue this series, and so grateful for you guys doing the heavy lifting on the background side. just helping us keep it well-rounded and balanced, but also being able to, present the level of detail that I know we both put into our episodes and our cases. We appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm very appreciative of like your knowledge and you being able to round out what I don't know or can't get. So it's going to be amazing. It's going to be amazing. I'm super excited.
Yeah.
And please, everybody, make sure that you are checking out both of our podcasts for information on, when we're releasing for the series that we're starting. And also make sure that you are checking out and keeping watch on the True Crime Pacific Northwest True Crime Fest that we're both going to be at and present at. And I'm super excited to have a friend in my corner now. I don't feel so bad and feel so anxious about being there.
Yes. And it's still TBD on whether or not Winston's coming, but we're still talking about it.
I mean, I will understand. I will understand if that can't happen, but I do hope that you have like some glossy 8x10s that you will have like a little paw print or something that
Yes, we are in the process of creating autographs.
Awesome. From her. I love it. Yeah. Like scanning because I know that you can do that. You can do like a paw print and scan it and then recreate it on a sort of rubber stamp and stuff. That is cool. We would gladly put one of those up on my board behind me. So Bryce can stare every day at your very, very elegant and distinguished Winston.
Yes.
I love it. All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining in. And please make sure that you join the conversation on social media. We both are on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Both podcasts are. We want to know your thoughts. We want to know. And what are some cases that you want us to cover in this genre, in this type of, setting? What can we bring to you? What do you want to know more about? What questions do you have? Let's have a dialogue. Let's have a conversation and let's, get some more knowledge out there and share.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And, we'll end this for our podcast as always. Please, everybody, be kind to one another and just, take care of one another and stay out of the damn woods.
Stay out of the woods.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.